The Messerschmitt Me was the world's first operational jet fighter. Whilst considered to be quite an effective aircraft, its late appearance towards the end of the Second World War was not quite enough to stem the Allied advance. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Revell Messerschmitt Me in 1/72 scale. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build and what it looks like at the end. As usual, I'll put a list of the different products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy having a go at this kit for yourself. But without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll cut away the parts that I need from the sprue using my cutters. Unfortunately, this kit does suffer from flash in a few places, so this will have to be carefully removed. I'll do this using a sharp knife and then sanding down any other rough areas. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build. And the first thing to assemble were the cockpit details. There aren't that many cockpit details, but you do get a reasonable representation inside the cockpit once all these parts have been added together. Once the cockpit has been assembled, I used some Humbrol 240, which is an RLM02 grey colour, as the base colour for the cockpit areas. This was painted onto the cockpit tub and also onto the internal walls of the fuselage. Vallejo English uniform would be used to pick out the moulded on seat belts on the chair. Vallejo black would be used to pick out various details such as the control panel, control column and other panels within the cockpit. It is worth noting that the cockpit tub actually features some nice detail moulded underneath it, which in theory could be seen from the wheel wells, but the wheel wells are moulded solid, so actually none of this detail will be seen at the end. I would also thin this down with a little water to make a thin wash, which would be applied to the entire cockpit assembly just to bring out some shade and contrast. With all of that done, the cockpit tub was glued into one of the fuselage halves. Because this aircraft features tricycle landing gear, I need to add some weight in the nose. Liquid gravity was superglued into both sides of the fuselage, attempting to add as much weight as possible to prevent it from falling over on its tail. Whilst that superglue is drying, I glued the nose landing gear bay into this component here. And now it's time to glue the fuselage halves together. The fit is generally okay, but a little bit of fiddling was needed just to get everything to line up perfectly. When that was done, I added this component which sort of blanks out a hole at the rear of the cockpit. This tooling can actually be built into a two-seater version as well, but those parts are not included in this version of the kit, so instead this blanking part needs to be installed. Turning the aircraft over to the other side, the nose gear bay part I built earlier can be glued at the bottom of the nose. Now it's time to join the lower wing surface onto the bottom of the aircraft. The fit here was actually quite good. And then this is followed by joining the upper wing surfaces onto the lower wing surfaces. Next, the tail surfaces can be glued into the slots at the back of the aircraft. And then I paid a little bit of attention to the seams and joins, sanding them down just to make them look a little more flush. Now I can turn my attention to the engine nacelles. These come in a number of parts and are relatively straightforward to build up. It was a little bit fiddly in a few places, just making sure the air intake nozzles are completely central, but once that was done, they could be glued into their respective positions on the relevant wings. You can't get this wrong, there is only one wing that they'll fit on correctly. Towards the back of the aircraft there is a sort of aerial mast ring, and this had to have the hole drilled out for it. It is possible there's a hole sort of inside the fuselage which I missed earlier on, so I just kind of guessed where it needed to go and opened up the hole for this part. With that glued into place, I added the clear part as well. The clear part is a little bit disappointing in this kit. It's not particularly well moulded and the canopy framework isn't particularly proud. Here I just glued it in with a little Tamiya extra thin. And in order to mask this, I've actually been out and bought the KV Models mask set specifically for this kit. Given that the canopy framework is not particularly present, I thought this would be the best way of getting the canopy looking about right. These self-adhesive masks were peeled from the backing sheet and then attached in the relevant place. However, I did have to add a little bit of extra tape in a few places just to close up any gaps that might be present. There are some gaps actually between the canopy and the fuselage. The canopy isn't quite perfect, so I filled in these gaps with some Humbrol Clear Fix. I'm trying to avoid any overspray from the primer I'll use shortly going inside of the cockpit and potentially making a mess. The landing gear on this aircraft looks fairly sturdy, and in order to get a good bond I thought I would install it at this point here. So the nose landing gear legs and then the main landing gear legs were glued into their holes on the bottom of the plane. It was a little fiddly to build these parts up, with the support struts on the main landing gear not having particularly positive places for them to sit, but it is possible to get it looking about right. After this I glued on the various lower side antenna, and I like to add parts before any paint has been applied because it gives a nice positive bond, plastic to plastic, for the cement to work. The pitot tube was added onto the wingtip, and I'll have to be super careful when handling this now not to knock this off. And now I'm going to turn my attention to the landing gear doors. This aircraft features a raised landing gear option, but if you want to display your gear lowered, you have to actually cut the doors to the correct shapes. They come as a single piece for the raised option, but for a lowered option, they need to be separated. I won't add them onto the aircraft yet though, I'll add them after painting. I haven't had to use any filler yet, but there is something I need to use this on. This A-1a putty surfacer was added into the particularly prominent ejector pin marks on the main landing gear wheels. Once I'd built up a good layer of this, it was carefully sanded when dry. And now it's time to prime. I'm using Tamiya Surface Primer in grey. You can see that the main wheels and the landing gear doors have been kept separate, and I'll add them at the end. But otherwise everything just receives a couple of thin coats of this paint to help ensure that any subsequent layers will stick to the model. And now on to some painting. First up, I'm using this polished metal from A-1a. There are a couple of panels on the lower side of the aircraft that need to be painted this colour. So these were painted and then they would be masked. Up next is this light blue RLM 76 from Vallejo. Whilst these are airbrush ready paints, I do find that I get a little bit of tip dry with them, so a drop of acrylic thinner will be added just to help them flow. This would then be airbrushed onto the lower side of the aircraft and the fuselage sides. Now onto the camouflage scheme. This Vallejo RLM 81 would be applied as the first layer of colour. I am trying to follow the paint scheme instructions included in the kit, but these are printed in black and white and I had to do a bit of extra research to try and figure out what would look about right. Some of this is going to be using some modeller's license. I am also doing this completely freehand to practice my airbrushing skills. I'm using a Harder and Steenbeck Evolution with a 0.4mm needle and nozzle. Perhaps I should have downgraded to the 0.2mm needle and nozzle that I have, as I do find that some of the mottling in a bit will be a bit large, but generally on a fairly low PSI, I found this airbrush worked pretty well for this job. Up next is RLM 82, and this will form the green part of the camouflage scheme. Again, this was airbrushed onto the aircraft, trying my best to get a neat camouflage scheme using the painting instructions as a guide. I did find with this particular paint scheme that I had to flip-flop a little bit between the earlier blue colour and the camouflage colours just to tidy up different bits here and there. Once that was done, I turned my hand to the mottling. So the mottling on the sides of the aircraft is completely done on a low pressure, and I had to rework this quite a bit. It's not really one of my favourite parts, and I am still practicing and learning this particular technique. I definitely think dropping down to the smaller needle would have been a good idea, but eventually, after quite a bit of time, I kind of got where I wanted to go with this and was ready to move on. The RLM02, which I used earlier, is carefully painted into the landing gear bays. I did this by hand, taking care to avoid the blue on the undersides. And then some Humbrol 25 would be mixed with a little drop of white to make a slightly lighter blue. This was carefully painted by hand onto the nose of the aircraft, following the panel lines as a guide. And then, with all of the paintwork applied, I added a layer of clear gloss. This should help seal in all of these paint layers and provide a nice smooth surface for the decals in the next step. The decals come on a medium-sized sheet and are printed to a reasonable standard. However, I think they may have been inkjet printed or laserjet printed because they don't seem to have the same quality as a silkscreen printed transfer set. I identified the transfers that I needed and cut them from the sheet. They were then dipped into warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you'd like to get your hands on your own brushwater mug, check out my merch store. Microscale, microset and sol will be my setting solutions in this build, and as normal, microset from the blue bottle was painted onto the areas the transfers were going to go, the transfer then applied, and then some microsol from the red bottle brushed over the top. This should help soften the transfers into the details on the plastic. Decal application was relatively straightforward. I did find the application of all the little stencils perhaps a little tedious, but the ones that I did struggle with a little bit more were the ones on the fuselage side. The decals are a little bit thick, a little bit papery, and the bands on the sides of the fuselage didn't want to adhere to the surface. Many repeated applications of microsol was required to get them to conform to the curved surface of the tail, but after a while it started to look okay. With all the decals now applied, it's time to give another coat of clear gloss. This should help seal these decals in and protect them from any weathering. I am going to do a little bit of weathering, but not a great deal to this particular kit. The weathering I am going to do is using some enamel blue-grey wash, which I thinned down with white spirit as I think it's just a little too vibrant, and I want a much more muted effect. This was then painted over the entire aircraft and allowed to run into all of the recessed panel lines. Whilst that was drying, I decided to paint the wheels in a matte black. And when that was dry, these could be given a bit of a wash as well. In this particular case, I've decided to go with a rust wash. Whilst it's not going to make the tyres look particularly rusty, it might help give them a slightly dirty effect, as though they've been rolling around the ground. When all of these washes were dry, I added the landing gear doors onto the landing gear legs and into the relevant positions around the landing gear bays. After this, the wheels could be glued onto the landing gear legs, and the pitot tube, which I mentioned earlier, I had to take care not to knock off. I did knock it off a few times, so this was the final point where I re-added it onto the model. And then the aircraft was given a coat of Humbrol No. 49 matte varnish. This is going to dull down that gloss and give a nice uniform finish. The final step was to carefully peel away the canopy masks, which seem to have done a pretty good job. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Revell Me262 in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. On the whole, I actually quite enjoyed building this one. I thought the level of detail quite nice and the fit was generally quite good too. Some of the things I wasn't so keen on were the fact that the canopy just isn't great, the moulded lines are virtually non-existent, and also it didn't quite fit perfectly and I had to use some clear fix as filler. Also, the decals are not the highest of quality. They work, they're absolutely fine, but I did struggle with the bands on the fuselage being a bit papery and just not wanting to conform to the curve of the fuselage. Also, despite applying gloss and a number of applications of the setting solutions, I have noticed a little bit of silvering in a few places. Also, the level of flash, whilst completely manageable, was a little frustrating to see, and those ejector pin marks on the wheels that I had to fill in, I feel probably could have been avoided had the ejector pins been put somewhere else on the sprue. Whilst I like that this kit comes with a raised landing gear option, sadly it comes with no crew figure, nor does it come with a stand. I do keep a note of everything that I do in my journals, and my journals are available on Amazon where you can write down your own builds and keep a diary of them if you'd like to do so. I did actually make a note in here that there was a slight short shot on one of the ailerons on the wings, but it's so minimal that it's hardly noticeable in the finished build. Additionally, I did make a note that this build took me 4 days to complete, so I must have been doing it around other commitments as well, but generally I think you probably could make fairly quick progress with this one. I did make a note in here that my own personal skills in regards to modelling do need some development, and I think I'll explore modelling in some more German aircraft in the future. For now though, I think it's okay, but definitely not quite right. But this comes down to a bit of modeller's license as well. So the paint scheme that I've replicated here is technically the one that's annotated on the box artwork, but it doesn't match that. The box artwork doesn't seem to be the same as what's technically included in the instructions, but the instructions are printed in black and white. But it's really difficult to determine from the black and white instructions what colour should actually be what. This is an area that Revell have improved in some other boxings, and I always think that including colour painting instructions is a much better way for manufacturers to go. Sadly, in this case, and on such a complicated paint scheme, the black and white instructions simply aren't good enough. You do get 2 paint schemes included in this kit though, but they are quite similar. And as I'm sure you've probably noticed, this isn't a particularly recent tooling, dating from 1997, although I imagine that the production of this particular variant has been available since 1999. This lends itself to the level of flash being present as a bit indicative of its slightly older tooling date compared to other manufacturers which might have more recent toolings with a slightly better degree of accuracy and detail. But that being said, for a 1997 tooling, I didn't find the fit of the parts or the level of detail to be particularly bad. In fact, I found that it fit together quite nicely. As I mentioned earlier on though, there was that included detail on the lower side of the cockpit tub, which technically I think you would be able to see from the landing gear bays, but the landing gear bays are blanked off. So if you want to see this, you'd have to cut the landing gear bays out. Also, drop tanks or rockets are included in the kit, which can be installed under the nose of the aircraft, but I decided I would display mine in a clean configuration. This kit, at the time I'm making this video, was retailing for €9.99, which if we convert to GBP is just over £8.50, which probably makes this one of the more cost-effective Messerschmitt Me 262s in 1/72nd scale. So if we keep that in mind, some of the shortcomings of this kit don't seem too bad. Granted, of course, there are more expensive offerings from other companies which may be a little bit better in quality. But I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up. Whilst this kit does have some shortcomings, I actually quite enjoyed building it, and I could definitely consider building another one like this in the future. Perhaps I'll look for the 2-seat variant. and see if I can have a go at that one. It was definitely great to have a bit of a practice with that modelling, and I'm looking forward to trying some more German subjects to further explore this technique. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my Model Club members. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. There are other ways to help support the channel as well, and full information is below the video. Of course, the best way to support the channel for free is to subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, from me here on the workbench today, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.